Prepara las palomitas. Está a punto de empezar En Sincronía, el podcast hispanoamericano de traducción audiovisual, con Damián Santilli, Blanca Arias Badía y Guillermo Parra.
Les damos la bienvenida al episodio número 37 de En Sincronía, el primer podcast de traducción audiovisual del mundo. Soy Damián Santilli y estoy sincronizado desde Buenos Aires, Argentina, con Blanca Arias Badía en Barcelona y Guillermo Parra en Menorca. Hola, Blanca.
Hola, ¿cómo estás, Damián?
Muy bien, todo muy bien. Guille.
Yo parece que he volado antes de coger el vuelo porque sigo en Canadá, pero llego a Menorca la semana que viene, eso sí.
Bueno.
Pero oye, me encanta ya que me sitúes en Menorca porque la verdad es que tengo ganas de un tiempo más razonable y de no estar sepultado en nieve.
Acá estamos esperando ansiosamente las vacaciones en febrero, así que después de un año con Ispatab y con esto y con lo otro, por fin... algo de vacaciones pronto, así que ansiosos todo el mundo en esta casa por escapar un poco del calor sofocante de Buenos Aires. Así que ahí estamos. Bueno, hoy vamos a tener un episodio muy interesante donde vamos a hablar sobre traducción automática, pero antes les quiero contar acerca de nuestro patrocinador, que es la mejor herramienta en línea para trabajar con subtítulos. En su suite de programas encontraremos herramientas para crear, traducir, revisar, transcribir, convertir, codificar, pegar y comparar subtítulos. Su interfaz web es muy intuitiva y fácil de usar y nos permite trabajar como profesionales de la manera más sencilla. Además, podemos optar por distintos métodos de licencias, desde una semana hasta un año, y también en su web encontrarán el programa educativo de y de Pool, que es una base de datos de profesionales para que se encuentren las empresas y los subtituladores. Pueden ingresar en una.net para probar el software gratis durante 4 semanas, mejorar su productividad y empezar a trabajar como profesionales hoy mismo. Y en el programa de hoy vamos a entrevistar a Yota Georgakopoulou, que seguramente lo pronuncié súper mal, pero es Yota, lo más importante que tenemos que saber, que es una traductora experta en localización audiovisual con especialización en aplicación de tecnologías del lenguaje en traducción audiovisual y en industrias creativas en general. Dueña de la empresa Athena Consultancy, que ya vamos a ver en la entrevista que pasó por diferentes rubros, por diferentes empresas, por un montón de cosas y que ahora se dedica más que nada a asesoría. Y bueno, ofrece servicios ahí para empresas muy importantes en áreas como estrategia comercial, calidad, herramientas, flujo de trabajo y un tema fundamental del cual vamos a hablar en todo el episodio, que es implementación de traducción automática en los distintos flujos de trabajo de las empresas. Desde el punto de vista formal, Yota tiene un doctorado en traducción y subtitulado, 20 años de experiencia en la industria y, recientemente es fundadora, hace un par de años ya, del capítulo griego de Women in Localization y también, como ella misma se define, además de escritora, como influencer de la traducción audiovisual. Así que, la entrevista va a estar muy bien porque va a estar enfocada a la actualidad de la traducción automática, a tratar de entender, más allá de las notas reverberantes que pueden aparecer en las redes y el ruido que hace la gente o lo que puede decir, efectivamente qué es lo que está pasando con la traducción audiovisual, cómo se está aplicando y qué expectativas tenemos para la profesión en general para el futuro. Así que va a ser un capítulo muy interesante que seguramente dará mucho de qué hablar. Y además, en el medio, después de la primera parte de la entrevista, vamos a tener las secciones de Blanca y de Guille. Vamos a empezar con Guille. ¿De qué va tu sección, este programa, Guille?
Pues yo voy a hablar de los subtítulos de una película que a lo mejor os suena, a lo mejor no. The Menu, el menú.
Sí.
Hombre, una película muy interesante, con sorpresa, no voy a añadir más, con un buen reparto, encabezado por Voldemort.
Encabezado por Anya Taylor-Joy, loco, que es argentina,
Iba a decirlo también. La chica de Gambito de Dama, por supuesto, la ajedrecista, que es una crack. Pero a mí me hacía gracia mencionar lo de Voldemort. Y sobre la traducción, pues nada, hablaremos de terminología culinaria y de expresiones del mundillo y de todo esto.
Muy bien, muy bien. ¿Y Blanca?
Pues yo, aprovechando que tenemos tesis doctoral nueva de traducción audiovisual y accesibilidad, voy a hablar de la tesis nueva que hay, que en este caso se leyó hace menos de 2 meses en la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. Fue de Irene Hermosa y que estuvo en el ISPATAP, así que quizás algunos oyentes del podcast ya la vieron presentar allí. Y fue una tesis sobre...
Un beso a Irene.
Un beso a Irene desde aquí. De hecho, la tendremos en la sección, porque ya que hay contacto, pues la hemos invitado para que nos...
Ya sabemos que no te gusta trabajar, Blanca, ya sabemos.
Y como ella es muy productiva y escribe mucho, pues venga, que hable en el podcast también.
Sí, ya sabéis que yo, si puedo traerme a los autores de los trabajos de los que hablamos en la sección, pues siempre lo hago, y así yo me reduzco la carga y los oyentes tienen la información directa, así que estupendo.
Muy bien, muy bien. Guille, vos tendrías que intentar entrevistar a los guionistas directamente de las series o películas que haces en tu sección, ¿no? Así.
Oye, ¿por qué no? Les digo, sacad un ratito, no sé, 3 minutos o 4 para mi sección. Comentamos muy superficialmente la traducción que ni siquiera sabéis que se hace.
Pero lo importante es por qué usaron tal o cual término. Ahí está, ya está.
Exacto.
Yo creo que Guillermo no puede hacerlo porque nos privaría de la voz del profesor
es verdad,
durante unos minutos.
Bueno, claro, no podría susurrar.
Tú no puedes, exacto. Se perdería el efecto ASMR. Así que...
Esto para mí saca un tema que me toca un poco las narices, y es que se empeñan en darnos plantillas. Lo digo ahora porque creo que es relevante para todo el mundo, pero cuando trabajas en subtitulación, digo yo que las plantillas o las listas de diálogos las podría tocar alguien que haya trabajado en el guión de la película o que sepa de qué va la película, porque a veces te encuentras con que pues nadie sabe del tema y dices, bueno, pero ¿y los guionistas no pueden ponernos una notita en un Excel y decir esto viene de aquí? Y no cuesta tanto, ¿sabes? Pero no hay voluntad.
Sobre todo en las plataformas de streaming, que hay como una conexión directa, ¿no? entre
con los creadores, claro.
Con los creadores, ¿no? Pero bueno, sí, ¿qué va a hacer? Se olvidan de nosotros. Pero por suerte, dentro de 2-3 meses ya va a ser toda la máquina, así que no nos tenemos que preocupar.
No,
¿qué es lo que vamos a hacer? ¿Qué es lo que vamos a hacer? Vamos a mirar TikTok de cosas hechas con inteligencia artificial. Y eso va a ser nuestra vida.
Gatitos de mentira.
Claro, sí, todo el tiempo. Bueno, muy bien. Hecha toda esta introducción, muy poco útil, vamos a comenzar.
Hemos perdido a 20 oyentes.
No, prometemos que la entrevista es seria, y vamos a trapo.
La entrevista vale mucho la pena, así que olvídense de esto de desvarío y vamos adelante con la primera parte de la entrevista a Yota. Hi everyone, welcome, and we are here with Yota. Hola Yota, how are you?
Hello Damian, hello everyone. Thank you for having me, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too, and thank you so much for being on the podcast. We know that you're a very, very busy woman, but we are going to be talking a lot today about machine translation and maybe the future of our profession as well. And I think you are the perfect person. I'm so excited to have you here. But for those who don't know you, please introduce yourself, and I don't know, maybe if you want to mention how you started in translation and studying and all that, studying translation, so everyone can know a little bit more about yourself. And please also tell us what are you doing actually right now?
Of course. First of all,
briefly, because I know that you do a lot of things. So.
Well, yes, it goes back to the previous century, doesn't it? It's my pleasure to be here, first of all. And congratulations for the work that you're doing with the podcast. I just wanted to say it. I watched a couple of episodes over the holidays, and it was great work.
Oh, thank you.
So for me, there's nothing really unconventional about how I started out. I studied English Lit, translation, and I started working as a translator from English into Greek, which is my native language. And that was in the 90s. But what wasn't common that I did at the time was to do a PhD in subtitling. That very few people were doing that back then. And I also started working as a subtitler, as a freelancer. So I know very well what it means to be a freelancer. But fortunately for me, when I was doing that in London in the 90s, Greek was an exotic language combination, very well paid. At the time, the work was done in-house in subtitling companies. There were not that many Greek subtitlers. It was fantastic. A fantastic time for me. I really loved it. And I actually helped the profession, mushroom, I can say, because I was one that set up and taught the first modules on subtitling in the UK at the University of Surrey and Westminster. Yeah, I was teaching the
What year is this?
Yeah.
When was it?
From 1997, I think, until 2001. I was teaching in the University of Surrey and Westminster. I was teaching the theory of subtitling to MA students and also the practice into Greek, and others were teaching the practice into other languages. And then I took an in-house position at a subtitling company, and I was asked to set up a translation department for subtitling into multiple languages. That was in 2000. That was when media localization had just begun to be centralized in London. Until then, it was fragmented. In each country, you would do the Greek in Greece and so on, but then everything started to be centralized. And it was a very, very exciting time. I like to call it the golden years, because the volume of work was growing very much like it's growing today, but the rates were fantastic. It was a period of growth for everyone.
That's not the case today.
There's a lot of growth today. We'll talk about that, and there are a lot of opportunities. But the rates are a bit different, I have to say.
That's another story. Okay.
That's a different story indeed, yes. And that company was called the European Captioning Institute, and I eventually became the managing director until 2010, when it was sold to Deluxe. And then I worked at Deluxe for 8 years. Everyone knows Deluxe. I was there in a senior role. I was leading research in media localization. I was also in charge of various initiatives to do with quality, workflows, talent and vendor onboarding. And I was investigating the implementation, the application of language technologies in subtitling. I was testing with all the vendors. I was collaborating with very high-profile universities in computer science and machine learning, like the University of Edinburgh, RWTH Aachen University, and the University of Zurich. This was mostly as part of EU-funded projects that I was leading on behalf of the company. And it was a great experience. I met a lot of very nice and very smart people and made some good friends too. And it's funny because the decision I made to specialize in language technologies at the time, everyone thought I was crazy for doing that. They thought machine translation would never catch on in our field because of the creative nature of our work, but I always believed in
wishful thinking.
Yes, well, I was always a believer in technology. I always thought that the developments in our field were following the developments that we saw in the wider localization industry. So for me, it was a given. It would happen sooner or later. And this is why I wanted to be there first. And because I did that, I am considered, because of that, a little bit of a guru on this topic.
You are.
Well,
that's why you're here.
But I'm not a scientist, though, right? It's funny sometimes when I get to speak instead of the scientist. But anyway, the other reason that I was interested in that was that we had a fantastic archive of subtitle files, very high quality ones, that I thought it would be a good way to monetize them. And I actually got the opportunity to test that archive in the SUMAT project that I worked on about 10 years ago or so. And that showed me really the potential that good quality data, subtitles in this case, can have on machine translation systems. I remember we had done an experiment, and only a fraction of this data, professionally created, perfectly aligned with the use of templates, would yield much better quality than 10 times as much freely available data that would come from amateurs. And this is why I'm a big believer in customization for the content owners and the language service providers that actually have in their availability a lot of such high quality data. And today, I left Deluxe 4 years ago, and I've been working as a consultant ever since. I set up my own firm. It's called Athena Consultancy. And now I have the opportunity to work for a variety of clients, which has given me a much wider perspective of the industry, and I'm loving it. Clearly, I work for language service providers, but I also work for content owners, which were previously my end clients, and I work for technology vendors, and actually one of the companies I consult for is Una, who are the sponsors.
We know them.
So they're sponsoring this podcast. So, thank you, Una, for sponsoring the podcast.
Thank you, Wayne.
And the projects that I work on are very different. They can be market research ones. I do I consult on software development. I perform user acceptance testing. I set up, design, and carry out training on subtitling, for instance, or dubbing, on post-editing. I draft guidelines. I do strategic consultations, for instance, on business development strategy, on pricing. I even do marketing work. It's really a mixed bag. It doesn't get boring.
You even prepare PowerPoints, right?
I do that, yes, I do. But the common denominator in all of this is that everything has to do with media localization. If you're my age, you've probably been in almost every position in the language service industry for media localization. So that helps.
Okay. So, just to sum this, you always worked with machine translation and technology, mainly focused on audiovisual translation, right? Or also in other areas as well?
Yeah, also for marketing texts.
Marketing text, okay.
Yes, not just, but it's all in the creative area.
Yeah, they're connected. They're connected.
Yes.
So you didn't work with technical translation?
No. The problems that you might have, what you will come across with machine translation in marketing is very similar to issues that you would have in subtitling, I find.
Okay. So let's begin with the current state of machine translation, because it's difficult to grasp the current state from different perspectives. Obviously, because you are inside of the whole thing. But when we see, translators commenting on social networks, or even companies or associations, it's not always clear that we do actually know how things are, how good things are. Maybe I see all the time, like people saying, like you mentioned before, like it's not going to replace us or whatever. But when we mention those things, it's like always, like I said before, wishful thinking, right? It's not. We don't say it because we know it, or for whatever reason. We say it because we don't want them to replace us, or partially replace us. So, what can you tell us about companies working to improve machine translation? We're mostly interested also to talk about today about the role that post-editing has mostly in LSPs, and how is this affecting our profession. I don't know. The idea of today, the show, is to end on a positive side. I'm going to say this from the very beginning. At the end, we'll know if that's the case. So, what can you tell us?
All right. That there's a lot actually to cover. It is a little bit of a packed question. Maybe it's a good idea to start chronologically a little bit.
Okay.
I don't know if people know that there has been experimentation with machine translation and subtitling for a lot longer that people are aware. I mean, I said I've been working with this for the past decade, right? But there are studies and early implementations, early attempts to implement machine translation in subtitling as far back as the early 90s. With rule-based machine translation.
Yeah.
And there was a system in the US actually automatically translating English closed captions into Latin American Spanish ones for the Spanish audience with rule-based machine translation.
I'd love to see those.
Probably very literal, I would expect, but it was a service for the Spanish audience, so they would have something in their language instead of nothing, instead of having to rely only on the English captions, right? And then there were also some attempts with statistical machine translation in the late noughties, even by SDI. None of these attempts really flew, but that was because of the quality of machine translation was worse in rule-based. It improved with statistical, but it became a lot more fluent with neural machine translation. And this is when I would say we started seeing a lot of implementations, about 4 years ago.
Can you briefly describe or compare them? So very briefly.
You mean the technologies or?
Yeah, they're rule-based, they're statistical and neural, so people know what we're dealing with.
Okay, rule-based machine translation is basically how the system works, if I can put it very bluntly, not scientifically. Someone has to write a lot of rules of the grammar in one language, in the source language and in the target, and these are mapped, and you use a lexicon, and this is how you get rule-based machine translation. So the old very literal word-for-word translations, this is rule-based machine translation. This is what it is. Statistical machine translation works on statistics, but you use a lot of data, so parallel data, pairs of subtitles and
previous translations. Okay.
Yes, and in a very, it's not scientific at all to say this, but it kind of works a little bit like translation memories in a way, right? The system sees the things that go together and then comes up with the most probable solution. Neural is supposed to replicate the human brain, and the difference to statistical is that it's a lot more fluent. That is the advantage. It can be so fluent that it can fool you. It can have errors in there that you don't notice because of its fluency. It can be a lot more creative, neural machine translation. That's why it's better for creative domains like subtitling. It doesn't handle terminology as well. So one of the things that you will notice if you use neural machine translation, if there's no glossary integration, the proper names will be messed up. They will not be translated consistently most of the time. You will see, a person's name, translated one way and then differently further down. So when you use neural machine translation for proper names and terms, you need to have some terminology integration. But as I said, it is a lot more fluent, and this is why it started being used. The first implementation I heard of was by iFlix in Asian languages. Their systems were built by a company called Omniscient, and then Netflix announced that they were using machine translation at the Media for All conference in 2019 in Stockholm. And then we saw a press release by Transperfect as well, advertising that they were using machine translation, their own machine translation in subtitling workflows. And ever since then, I believe more or less everyone has experimented with it. Whether they implemented it or not, or whether they speak publicly about it or not, I believe everyone has tried it.
Okay.
Least, let's say.
But it's very recent.
It is very recent, yes. In our field, it is very recent. And I actually remember training some translators that were technical translators in subtitling, because they needed to subtitle videos as well as just translate text. And I had a conversation with them about subtitling editors. That was like 3 years ago. And I remember being asked about machine translation by them at the time. And I told, well, there weren't many integrations available in subtitle editors back then. And I said, well, it's not integrated in this editor, for instance. And they were like, what? And how can you translate? without it. So it's like, really?
You'd be surprised.
It will be surprised, yes. And in November, I was at the Translating Europe Forum in Brussels. I was chairing a panel there. And at that panel, I had Dr. Anna Zaretskaya from Transperfect. She's the Machine Translation Strategy Director. So I actually had the opportunity to ask her a lot of questions on the subject about what they do at Transperfect. Like I said, Transperfect is one of the first companies that implemented it. The panel is actually recorded and available on YouTube if you want to follow it in more detail.
Yeah, we'll put a link on the description of the show.
And when I talked to her, she talked about the production complexities that determine where the technology is used. Basically, she was talking about content profiling. And content profiling is true for both speech recognition and machine translation. And what it means is that not all types of videos lend themselves exactly in the same manner to the use of this technology. Even when we talk about speech recognition, which is a more mature technology than machine translation, and it's a lot easier to see the benefit of speech recognition in production. You'll get videos with a lot of background noise or overlapping speakers, which can't really be transcribed very well as a result. And it's the same for machine translation. She was also explaining in that panel that although it's their default way of working at Transperfect, to use machine translation that is, it's the type of content that determines their use. They decide which content to apply MT on or not, and they consult with their clients. They even recommend to their clients to use machine translation or not to use it. For instance, the example she gave was informational content. It makes sense if you have technical content videos rather than entertainment content. The language will be scripted, it won't be spontaneous, it won't be full of figurative language or slang, so it's easier to apply machine translation there. And she also said that apparently they don't use machine translation in any high-profile content that would be of strategic importance to their end clients. I've heard of another interesting use case of machine translation, actually, in our field, and that's for as an intermediate step when you have non-English source audio workflows, which, as you know, you probably worked on some, are more tricky to work on than the straight English into any language that we used to do for most of the content until now. Now that there's a lot of other languages as a source, you still have an English template as an in-between, as the pivot, right? But when you don't have multiple streams, then having this English, so if you have only, let's say, I don't know, Greek into Hebrew, Korean into Brazilian or something, and there's no other target languages, becomes and there's not many translators actually that you can find that can translate in these directions. So it can become very expensive to create an English template in order to complete the subtitling. So what I've heard of people doing is using a transcript of the source audio, then machine translating it into English, to use that machine translation as the basis for the translation into the target language because of the lack of a subtitler that could translate straight from the source. It's an interesting approach, I find, and I think it will happen more and more because of the increase in non-English audio content, and the lack of translators.
Lack of translators, yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
That in those language combinations, right?
Yeah.
So I think it will happen a lot. And I think it's, I'd be interested to see how those workflows go, because I think with some post-editing to fix all of the mistranslations and with the right amount of annotations, I think it could work, because that intermediate step won't be published anywhere. And anyway, in pivot templates, it's actually better to use, in my opinion, a more literal translation to help the target language translator when they don't understand the source, because sometimes some flair of the source can be lost when you translate into English. So yes, I expect to see more of that.
So when you're telling that they're incorporating machine translation in these workflows, that means that the task that we do is only to post-edit, or they offer, I mean, it's just another option like it was with translation memories, or we only get paid, let's say, and the only thing we have to do is to edit the translation, that the translation output.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm following your question. If you're talking about rates, I don't know how people are paid.
No. I mean, the thing is that there are some companies that, for instance, I do work not in audiovisual translation, but in technical translation. I do have some projects with companies that the automatic translation, the machine translation is there, and I can use it or not. But it doesn't change what I'm paid. I'm paid to translate. I'm not paid to post edit. So it's another resource that I can use. And actually, we all can do it even if we're not working with an LSP. If you're working with a direct client and you're using Trados, for instance, you can activate the machine translation feature and do that. But my question is, in those cases, for instance, but in the case of TransPerfect or other companies that you might know, we don't need to mention the companies. We are hired only to post edit, or is it that the machine translation is just another a feature for us to
I understand your question. So if we're talking about, forget about that pivot example that I gave you, because in that case it's clear. Spanish. If it's English into Spanish, then different companies follow a different approach. There are some that, and I agree with this actually, this is what I recommend, that make the machine translation available to their translators, for the translators to do whatever they want with it, to use it or not use it, to have it as another resource. And I believe they're doing this in order to give translators a chance to experiment with it, to familiarize themselves with how to use it, to see how it's useful. As I said, this is something that's very new. This is something that you would need to do in the beginning, and it makes sense to do that as a language service provider, also for the language service providers to figure out how useful the machine translation is to translators, how much it helps them, whether it actually saves them time or how much time does it save them, to collect metrics, to do a proper implementation. Implementing machine translation properly is not an easy task. It takes time. And it takes a lot of communication. It takes money, of course, yes, because it doesn't come for free, right? And change management, is a lot of effort on a lot of people to change the workflow. Other companies, go follow a different approach and basically ask translators to post-edit, and there are some that immediately also apply discounts in the rates for this post-editing without it necessarily being very well thought through, in my opinion. If you don't collect a lot of data to really understand how much machine translation helps people, how can you come up with fair and equitable rates? It's hard to do that if you don't have the data. So I do agree with the companies that follow the more relaxed, let's say, but also slower approach of allowing people to experiment with machine translation for a while, to get their feedback, to collect the data. This is what I've always recommended. And I'm glad that there are companies that are doing it. These are the companies that will be successful, in my opinion.
Great. So thinking about our future as professionals, so it looks like we need to be trained on this, right? On post-editing. I mean, if we are going to the second scenario that you describe, in which we are paid as always, but we need to post-edit, is not an option for us to do that in the future. You think we all have to be doing training on that?
Well, first of all, I mean, even for the companies that are allowing translators to experiment and so on, clearly the goal for everyone, it makes sense that it is to save time to begin with, right? To do the work faster, which is very important, especially as windows are becoming shorter and shorter, release windows. And it is eventually also to cut the costs, right? You hope that the machine translation will get better and better. The work on the translators will become post-editing, that is, will become easier and faster, and eventually you would expect to have to pay less in total. But this less in total doesn't mean less money for the translators necessarily, right? And I'll explain what I mean.
Please do explain that.
Well,
because I'm not seeing it.
Okay, well, basically, let's take, for example, this famous 30%, right? Let's assume that using a specific machine translation, you do the work faster, you can deliver the same quality of a file, and you do that 30% faster, right? And let's also assume that after 8 hours of this type of work, you're not more tired than you would have been had you just been translating from a template without machine translation for 8 hours, right? In this scenario, if you were paid 30% less per minute or per word or per whatever your rate is, you would end up making the same amount of money because your hourly rate would be identical. Because at the end of the day, your fee, your salary, the money that you make is how much money you make per hour, right? If you are paid, 10 cents per minute, for example, to translate, and you're paid 5 cents to post edit, just making numbers up here, but you can translate more than double the amount of content when you're post editing, then you're not losing money with the 5. It's not a lesser fee, right? It's how much you make per hour. You work for 8 hours and you've made, for instance, $100. And in the other scenario, have you made $100 or have you made 120? If you've made less, then you lose money.
Okay.
And people don't really think about it that way at first. Maybe some do.
Yeah. I think it's very difficult for translators to think beyond the rate per word or rate per minute. In this case of subtitling, there have always been propositions of thinking about how much you should earn per hour and not per whatever you want to call it. But if you look at associations here in Argentina, in Latin America, that they can provide like a guide on rates, they always do it per word, for instance. No, so I think it's a paradigm shift that is going to be complicated.
You don't necessarily have to be paid per hour as long as you know what you make per hour, which is important, right?
Yeah, I know. But in that case, everyone is going to be saying, okay, the rates are now, $3 per minute. And 5 years ago, they were $4 per minute. No, they always do this easy math. And
of course, maybe in the 90s they were $5 per minute or whatever they were. But back then, timing, a subtitle was so much more cumbersome than it is today.
Or translating from a VHS.
It took you a lot longer because you had to do a lot of other things, right? Even the fact that you can, work from home. For me, when I had to do a translation from a template back in the 90s, I would get a VHS at home. I would subtitle in my computer at home. Then I would have to go in the office. There was traveling time involved. It was a long distance from my home to that particular company's office. Go in, review the file there so I could see my subtitles against the video there. I couldn't do that at home. It wasn't a possibility back then. Sign it off, and then I would be paid. And then so these were hours that I was spending to complete the job. So if you just think about, the per minute rate, it doesn't really say much. What you really should be thinking is, how much am I making per month? How much am I making per a full working day? And doing it per hour actually helps. And my proposition also to language service providers is to share the benefits, is to, if machine translation does indeed save people, for instance, 30% of their time, and they do want to apply some sort of discount to the rate, that they shouldn't actually apply the exact same discount as the time saving. They should actually apply a lesser discount so that everyone benefits, that the translators who, do this post-editing work also, and who offer feedback and who help improving the machine translation system, also earn more per hour as a result, not in the absolute, per minute rate, but per hour as a result. So they also benefits. So, back to the training question that you asked, because you asked me, should we all be trained?
Yeah, be trained on being post-editors.
I do think post-editing is part of the future of subtitlers. There's going to be a lot of content that people will be asked to post-edit, more and more of it. There's a lot of content that needs to be localized, and there's a lot of content that can't be localized yet because of cost reasons, which could be made available in other languages if the cost threshold was lower. Maybe it can't currently
So there's even more work there.
There's even more work, yes. And maybe machine translation can actually help make this content localized with some post-editing. So there's all the major streamers that people work for, right? But there's a lot of ad-supported streamers that don't have the same budgets for localization that major studios do. So they don't localize, but maybe they have some budget for localization, which could be serviced with a specific type of workflow that could involve machine translation. So, of course, people should be trained on post-editing because if you want to be able to take on such work, I'm not saying you should, if you're in the privileged position to just, if you can afford to be picky about your work and about the tasks you perform, by all means, you should be doing that, right? You should be taking on the tasks that you, enjoy the most or that you make the most money out of. That's only common sense in any profession. But there is going to be large volume of work out there that will be available for post-editing. So if you want to work on such content, then it is a good idea to be trained and to train new translators at universities because post-editing is just a different task. So you need tips, you need to understand how to do the work, you need guidelines, you need the tricks that will tell, to learn some tricks on how to perform the task so that you can do it better and faster, and you need practice. But as I said, you can find your own value and you can decide which tasks to work on. If you don't want to work on post-editing, you don't have to. It's exactly the same thing like proofreading. And I don't mean that post-editing is proofreading, because it's not. It's different task as a task, but it's the same logic. Some people like to proofread other translators' work. Most translators I know don't enjoy these tasks. They enjoy to translate from scratch. And most translators at university, when we all went to university, we thought we were going to be authors, right? Write text. We didn't become translators because we were dreaming we're going to correcting other people's work. For most people, I think that is true. So if you can afford to pick the jobs and only pick translation tasks, by all means, do that. It's the same thing.
The question is mainly because it looks like more challenging to be doing that than just translating, because here I'm talking just on Latin America, but you constantly see bad translations on TV, and those are made by people. So we
see them here as well. Yeah.
I don't mean to be rude. So if you're going to be a good post editor, you need to be like a better translator than you would have been if you would have been translated. I don't know if that makes sense, but if some people are translating now and their translations are worse than what Google or whatever can offer.
Yes.
And then to correct that, to edit that, you need to be like a much better translator, So
Yes.
it's a huge challenge, and I hope everyone can see
when people do say that machine translation is going to replace translators, I don't believe that, first of all. And if it replaces anyone, it would be the bad translators, actually. In my opinion. And yes, I do agree you need to be a very good translator to be an editor. Even when it comes to proofreading and review tasks, I always say, you can't use a new person to perform these tasks. You need an experience.
Yet many companies do that, right?
Wrongly, in my opinion. They should not be doing
I see
this.
that too. Mm-hmm.
Because that has a result in a lot of errors in the end. You do need an experienced person. And with post-editing, you do need training. And it's true that the more experienced you are, the better you will be able to pick up on the errors, especially when there are many of them, right? Machine translation will improve. The errors will be reduced further and further and further. This will keep happening. But when there's many, it's easy to miss some, isn't it? So the more experienced a translator, the more easy for that translator to identify these errors
problems
and fix them. And studies that have taken place have actually shown in machine translation and post-editing in general, not necessarily just in subtitling, have shown that people who are inexperienced tend to make more superficial corrections, whereas the experienced translators would go deeper in the text and basically correct everything. Actually, overcorrect is what the studies have shown.
But I'm also thinking that you need to be very creative because most of the easy task, the mechanical translation part of subtitling in the future will be just for the computer. And so you'll be always dealing with the most difficult parts of a translation. So if you are a new translator or a bad translator, you won't be able to deal with those texts in particular, those parts of the texts. So, Guille?
Yeah, sorry, it's always the same. Like I was about to say, like, Yota, thank you for your presentation. I feel like I'm attending a conference here. It's really interesting. Yeah, I want to mention you were talking about errors, and this is something that I don't really know the answer to this question, so it's also the reason why I'm asking it, but also for the audience, because one may think if at some point we stop translating from scratch, or we almost stop doing that, and everyone becomes a post editor, and we feed the translation machine models with post edited material, how do you think that would impact the results we get? So if you say that we will get increasingly less and less errors, how does that correlate to the fact that we're going to be post-editing more and more, and if perhaps there are different quality levels that we can feed to the system? I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay, when I said post-editing more and more, I didn't mean post-editing having to fix more errors. I mean more volume of work to be post-edited, right?
Oh, okay, no, but what I mean is that there will be less errors in the translation.
Fewer
right?
errors, exactly, yes.
Fewer errors,
You can see that, check machine translation from 2 years ago and check machine translation systems from today, and they are better. Check machine translation systems that have been trained with more and better data. They produce better quality than machine translation systems that have been trained with less data or less in-domain data. So this will keep happening. I don't know if you're trying...
Yeah, but I'm referring to translation not just measured as the number of errors per word or per subtitle, but more in a positive sense. So the ability to find creative solutions, if those solutions... So it's not just there will be less errors, which kind of makes sense, but also if nobody comes up with a certain solution because everybody's post-editing, how will that ever be used by a translation machine model. That's what I mean.
I think you're talking about impoverishing language. Is that?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, there are discussions on this. First of all, there's two aspects, right? One aspect is a lot of people say that machine translation post-editing results in more errors in the end file, in the deliverable. I believe this can be avoided by using a proofreader afterwards. As I said, if we are at the point when there's a lot of errors in the post-editing text, and there have been studies, Jan Pedersen did one that he presented at Languages in the Media recently, where he compared the work of a translator translating from a template and translating with the help of machine translation, so basically post-editing, and then they compared how many errors did these translators have in the files that they delivered, and they found that they had more errors in the post-edited texts. This could have been for many reasons, including the translators not having any training in post-editing and not knowing how to do what to do exactly. But in my opinion, you shouldn't look at that. You should look at what gets delivered. So there should be a second pair of eyes. There should be a proofreader there. And it is a good idea to actually measure what work the proofreader does. Do they end up having to do more work on a post-edited translation versus a translation that wasn't post-edited? And what are the errors that are left in the final file, if any? I actually asked this question again to Anna Transperfect because I was curious if they had any metrics on that. They didn't, but what she told me is they couldn't find more errors in the final files because there were no client complaints about them. So there were no rejections. There were not more rejections from the clients. So there were no more errors. I think it is worth checking more the work of the proofreader. But having said this, with the right training, I do believe that the quality can be the same if you have a second person in the loop, right? As you should always have, because as Damian said, there's a lot of, just by when a translation goes through just the translator, not a second pair of eyes, it's definitely not the same quality. Now, the other angle on this is habituation. This is something I don't necessarily have an answer to. So people say that translation limits your thinking, right? Some people complain about how the machine translation, saying that it won't allow you to come up with the creative translation that you would have already come up. This can be solved with training and with the right user interface. So this is something that I discuss a lot with translators at PostEdit, is not having the machine translation in your face and over-typing it to correct it, but having it on the side, kind of a different column. And I know a couple of companies have actually implemented this in subtitling, and those translators that work with those particular systems, don't want to name any names, are actually much happier using the machine translation because it is on the side as an aid. Even psychologically, it makes a difference. And also, if it's not in your face, it also gives a translator a chance to think before looking at the translation. When I was translating, and granted that was a very long time ago, I remember I was reading the source text and listening to the video, and I was already thinking how I would say this in Greek, right? And this is what I advise people to do when I train them, to try to think of the translation before they look at the machine translation output, before they think about whether to use it or not. And I believe it does take some practice so that it doesn't impede your creative thinking. Now, the bigger problem, though, that is a problem, I believe, is the variety in the language. So let's say you're post-editing. If you have a and there's a lot of synonyms in language, right? And when we speak, generally, we will use different words. We will use a lot of variety. We will say, hello in a lot of different ways in a language. We won't say the same word over and over and over again, even if good morning is a correct translation of a given phrase of kalimera. You won't necessarily say always good morning. Maybe you will say morning. Maybe you will say something else, right? Just off the top of my head. Now, however, when you post-edit, if you have a translation that is correct, you don't
touch it.
you don't touch it, right? So if the translation always comes up as those two, good morning, and not of any of the other variations, then you won't change it because it is correct, and stylistically as well, if the style is right. So there has been another study that has shown basically that in post-edited texts, there's less variety in the language, in the use of the synonyms, than you would find if text was created from scratch. This is something that I don't have an answer to. I do want to point it out. So I don't know if it will become an issue in the future. But on the other hand, I keep thinking, it's not as if all translators have this great artistic flair. And
That's true, yeah.
I mean, if you just look at translation memories, right, which are basically a collection of human translations, there's a lot of junk in there. People have to clean out translation memories all the time because of the errors that they find in those translations that were created by translators. So a lot of the subtitles out there are average in terms of the quality and the language use. And post-editing also has to do with the ability of the translator. I believe as someone who is an excellent translator is likely to do excellent work as a post-editor as well. So,
So that's the idea. You need to be better.
You need to be better at what you do.
Better
anyway.
than in the past. So.
If you're not a good translator, you will have more errors even in a work that is not post-edited. Some people some adequate. I think machine translation post-editing is a good option for workflows or content where adequate is enough for the end client. And I think it is an opportunity for language service providers and for translators to offer different quality levels that Guillermo mentioned for different content that is priced differently. Because in the past, I remember every single LSP would say, I have the best translators and my translations are the best. It's impossible for everyone in the market to have the best translators. And
above average. Everybody's above average.
Someone has to be the average one, right? I mean, all of my students got hired if they wanted a job. Not all of them were, brilliant. Some had just passed their MA and others, got a distinction. I'm sure they didn't produce the same translations when they worked as translators. That's a different argument.
But that's another show, a different episode completely. Translators and their idea of how they translate.
And I also, that actually, in my opinion, should be reflected in the pay. That thing, if you are translating English into Greek, you get paid whatever it is these days, I don't know, $3, $4, $5 per word. It's not a blanket rate. I don't translate the same way as someone else. My quality is not the same after 20 years of experience as a person that just graduated. We should not be paid the same. We should be paid according to the quality that we offer, just like in any other profession.
Yeah. So on that note, we are going to take a small break here, and we're going to listen to Guillermo and Blanca and their sections, and then we'll be back with more with Yota.
A todos los subtítulos les faltan caracteres, pero a los mejores nunca les falta personalidad. ¿Qué los hace tan especiales? Quédate y descúbrelo con Guillermo Parra. Bienvenido a Subtítulos con Carácter.
Saludos, curiosos y amantes de los subtítulos. Hoy voy a hablaros de la película The Menu, El Menú, que llegó durante el mes de enero a Disney Plus y que básicamente trata de una pareja que viaja a una isla exclusiva para disfrutar de un menú de degustación que solo los millonarios se pueden permitir, preparado por el chef Slovik. Este misterioso chef, encarnado por Ralph Fiennes, dirige a todo su equipo de cocina pues casi como si de una secta se tratara. Y esto tiene mucho que ver con la primera cuestión traductológica que quería comentar, y es que hace que todos sus empleados lo llamen chef, pero chef como nombre propio. Esto se mantuvo en la traducción al español de España, por ejemplo, donde la pareja está hablando de él y Nicholas Hoult dice: ¿habré cabreado a chef? A lo que Anya Taylor-Joy responde: no hace falta que lo llames chef, porque no es su nombre, ¿no? Se llama Slovic. Sin embargo, en la versión latinoamericana se optó por utilizar el artículo, el chef, porque al fin y al cabo es su profesión, no es su nombre, ¿no? Lo que pasa es que al llegar a esta conversación, la solución no tiene sentido, porque Nicholas Hoult dice: ¿no crees que el chef esté enojado conmigo, no? Y ella le responde: no tienes que llamarlo chef, Tyler. Pero claro, él lo ha llamado el chef, se ha referido a él por su profesión, cosa que en este contexto tiene todo el sentido del mundo, así que la objeción no se entiende, o al menos no se entiende sin tener en cuenta el texto de partida. Y cambiando de tema, como estamos hablando de una película sobre cocina, sobre gastronomía, me gustaría mencionar, aunque sea por encima, la cuestión de la terminología gastronómica. No soy ningún experto sobre la materia, lo que sí he notado, por ejemplo, es que en la versión de España iban más allá e introducían términos que no estaban en la versión original en inglés. Esto, dependiendo del contexto, puede funcionar o no. Yo creo que en este caso funciona muy bien, sobre todo porque le da un toque de sofisticación, de autenticidad. Os pongo varios ejemplos. Cuando en inglés hablan de 12 customers, que son los clientes que hay en el restaurante, porque realmente es así de exclusivo, en la versión latinoamericana lo traducen como son 12 clientes en total. 12 clientes, que es traducción perfectamente correcta de customers. ¿Qué pasa? Que la versión española va más allá y dice 12 comensales en total. Y es el término específico de las personas que se sientan a una mesa a comer. Otro ejemplo, cuando hablan del vino que toman con la cena, el sommelier lo describe como just a wonderful match para un plato en particular, ¿no? Esto en Latinoamérica se tradujo como que combinaba maravillosamente con el plato, y en España dice que marida muy bien. Y esta elección del marida me ha encantado precisamente porque se usa mucho en este contexto, ¿no? No hablamos solo de catas, sino de maridajes también. Entonces, creo que ha sabido utilizar muy bien la terminología para recrear el lenguaje de alguien del mundillo, porque al fin y al cabo está en un restaurante donde sale a $1.200 el tenedor. Otra cuestión que me ha llamado la atención al comparar ambas versiones es el uso del tratamiento formal o informal, en segunda persona. En la versión latinoamericana hablan principalmente de usted. Es un contexto muy formal y es lógico que sea así. Mientras que en la española hay alternancia en algunos casos entre usted y tú, que yo creo que está justificada por el tipo de película que es y por cómo son esas escenas. Me explico. Se trata de un thriller psicológico, ¿no? Donde las cosas no son lo que aparentan, entonces aparentemente se usa el usted, se es formal, pero hay momentos en los que esa barrera de las apariencias se rompe y los personajes son más bruscos y más cortantes de lo que uno esperaría, ¿no? En el contexto. Entonces ahí creo que el uso de tú funciona muy bien, especialmente cuando se dirigen a alguien por su nombre de pila. Pero de todos modos creo que es algo relativamente subjetivo porque, de hecho, en las versiones dobladas tampoco siguen el mismo criterio. Y hasta aquí el tema de hoy. Recordad que si queréis seguir al tanto de novedades en subtitulación, podéis seguirme tanto en Twitter como en Instagram y estar atentos al hashtag subtítulos con carácter. Gracias por escuchar y hasta el próximo episodio.
En este podcast no nos gusta que la investigación sobre traducción audiovisual y accesibilidad se quede guardada en un cajón. Empiezan los minutos divulgativos con Blanca Arias Badía.
Hola, ¿cómo estáis? Ya he dicho en la introducción que tenemos tesis doctoral nueva en el ámbito de la traducción audiovisual y la accesibilidad, y no podíamos dejar escapar la ocasión de invitar a su autora a participar en estos minutos divulgativos para saber un poquito más de este trabajo nuevo. Es una tesis que ha hecho Irene Hermosa en la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, en el grupo Transmedia Catalonia, bajo la dirección de Miquel Edo. El trabajo consiste en un estudio de corpus. Los estudios de corpus son una metodología que ya tiene un recorrido de más de 30 años en los estudios de traducción. Se han hecho aportaciones muy interesantes para nuestra disciplina. En este caso, la gran aportación es que todavía no había ningún estudio en profundidad de la audiodescripción de la ópera como un texto, digamos, de pleno derecho. Los guiones de audiodescripción, ¿cómo son lingüísticamente? Esa es la gran pregunta de investigación que ha respondido Irene, con la que sin más dilación os dejo. Le he pedido que nos mandara un audio y nos contara absolutamente lo que ella quisiera de su tesis.
Sabemos que el doblaje y hasta cierto punto los subtítulos tienen rasgos de oralidad, pero ¿y la audiodescripción? ¿Y la audiodescripción operística? Estas fueron algunas de las preguntas que me planteé al comenzar mi tesis doctoral en la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, que defendí el pasado 20 de diciembre. Mi objetivo más general era definir el lenguaje de la audiodescripción y la audiointroducción, que es el fragmento de 5 a 15 minutos que se locuta antes de que empiece la representación y que suele incluir el resumen de la obra, sus elementos visuales más relevantes, el elenco. Todo ello mediante un estudio de corpus lingüístico con una muestra de guiones del Liceo de Barcelona y del Teatro Real de Madrid. Un segundo objetivo consistía en definir la priorización de los signos en la ópera, es decir, la escenografía, los audiosubtítulos, la danza, la música instrumental, el vestuario, también en los guiones de audiodescripción. Lo que observamos en las audiodescripciones propiamente dichas son características más cercanas al registro oral que en el caso de las audiointroducciones. Algunos ejemplos son una mayor proporción de verbos, es decir, un mayor énfasis en la acción, oraciones y palabras más cortas que las audiointroducciones y también menos palabras infrecuentes que las audiointroducciones. Además, estas últimas son más difíciles de entender que las audiodescripciones propiamente dichas, y esto es tanto desde un punto de vista léxico como textual. Hay que aclarar que la audiodescripción operística representa un reto particular, diferente de la audiodescripción fílmica, por ejemplo, por la necesidad de incorporar constantemente los audiosubtítulos, que recogen los diálogos que se proyectan sobre el proscenio, en lo que llamaríamos los sobretítulos. Esto, además del resto de todos los signos teatrales y de la música instrumental y vocal, que han de respetarse sobre todo en las áreas y los pasajes más conocidos y reconocibles. Si os interesa conocer los resultados completos de mi investigación, pronto se publicará mi tesis en acceso abierto y el título es La audiodescripción para ópera en España, estudio desde la lingüística de corpus y la semiótica.
Pues le agradecemos muchísimo a Irene que haya participado en este episodio y os voy a dejar a todos en la cajita de información del podcast la web donde muy pronto estará disponible su tesis para quien quiera consultarla. Muchas gracias y nos vemos en los próximos minutos divulgativos.
So we're back with the second part of the interview with Yota, and so we want to start the second part with a very difficult question, maybe. Why do you think, so far I've been seeing some positive sides to machine translation here in this interview, so the question now is, why do you think that professional associations, I like to say most of the community of professionals as well, always have such a strong opposition to machine translation and what is currently happening with LSPs and their workflows and all that?
Well, I think that's absolutely normal, actually. It's exactly what happened in the 90s when translation memories were introduced in text localization workflows. Translators were against the use of TMs for a while, and now you have translators.
Some are still against, still today.
Are they? Because today I actually hear people, where is my translation memory? Okay.
I know a few that don't like to translate with the translation to the weird, but they exist.
Overall, though, you actually hear people asking about translation memories. Even Atreya has asked for translation memory integration in subtitle editors, and they think this will be very useful. And I agree. I think the reason maybe is that a technology, when it's introduced to begin with, is not as good as it is today. I'm sure translation memories were not as good in the 90s as they are today, right? And machine translation will be much better in 3 years than it is now. So that's that to begin with. The technology needs to be fine-tuned. But I think the main reason is that oftentimes, clearly companies do want to use technology to make things, as we said, faster, but also to lower costs. The problem is when this is done not in a fair and equitable manner. Right. I always say that half the story in machine translation, the use of machine translation, is how it's implemented. It doesn't matter how good your machine translation is. If you mess up the implementation, you're not going to be successful. And what is implementation? It is, first of all, the user interface, building it properly so that it's user-centric, so that people are really assisted in the tasks. If you are asked to use machine translation in some very cumbersome way where you have to copy and paste and do a lot of keyboard commands to get the text there so as then to correct it, then of course it's a nightmare for the translator. Who likes that? You also need to be... Exactly. So you also need to be trained in the task. You need to be given clear guidelines about what to do to begin with. What do people expect of you? How much do they expect you to correct? One of the main things, guidelines that I've worked on actually, is to provide guidelines as to what are the types of errors. This is core part of training on post-editing. What are the types of errors that people are likely to encounter in machine-translated text, and how, and examples of these errors, and how are these errors fixed, and how much should you fix them? A lot of people, when they talk about post-editing, actually, and if you look at the TAUS guidelines and some of the other guidelines that are around, actually advise that you should not correct style errors, which in my opinion is wrong when it comes to creative texts. You absolutely must correct style errors when you are working in a creative field like marketing or subtitling. That's what the text is all about, style. Right? Yeah. If you get that wrong, there's no. If it was an informational video, it's a different story. Maybe there you don't need to, or the client doesn't want to pay for that, whatever. But if it's entertainment, it's not going to be entertaining if it's not the right style. So you need training, you need clear guidelines, you need communication about this change. Any change management, any change in the workflow requires change management, and communication is a core part of it. And of course, most importantly, it has to do with pay. You really need, as I was explaining before, you really need to pay people appropriately. If you're going to be, if you end up earning less per day, per hour, per month, you're not going to be happy. You won't want to do this. You will feel you're ripped off. If you end up earning the same, and even better, more, then I think translators would be more willing to embrace the technology because they would make more money.
But what I don't always see this, but what I sometimes see in, for instance, in Twitter or whatever you want to call it, in other social networks, is that most of the when they it's not that they're saying, oh, these companies, they are the worst because they're using this bad, and that's why we get paid less, or the quality is that. They always are these blog posts or whatever talking about machine translation itself. Not that the problem actually is maybe what we are seeing now. For instance, the third scenario that you described before, where companies use whatever machine translation for whatever kind of text, but the problem is the technology itself, and not how companies are using the technology. I mean, that's why you read. It's not the problem actually. That no.
I disagree there, and I think it's easy to argue against the technology and say it's not good because you don't want it to be used. Why don't you want it to be used? Because there's two factors in machine translation, right? There's the money factor. Are you making the same or more or less amount of money? Nobody wants to make less money for the same amount of work, including tiredness, right? I'm not talking about only working the same amount of hours, but being not more tired than that. Interpreters only can afford to work a few hours per day and not a full 8-hour day because the cognitive load is too much and their work is very taxing. So if post-editing leaves you half dead after 8 hours of work, clearly it's not the same as, if you translate for 8 hours, you could keep going for another 4 hours perhaps, because you don't feel tired. So there's a difference there. If you feel just as tired, The question is, how much do you earn at the end of that? And this is part of what people don't like. The other part is maybe they don't enjoy the actual activity. And I get that, because translating film is fun, right? I mean, I used to teach at university subtitling, and I used to teach legal translation as well. My subtitling classes were packed. It was the most popular class in the whole course. My legal translation class was the least popular class in the whole course.
I wonder why is that?
Like my students there, right? So of course it's fun. And this is why people go into it. A lot of people go into it. And if you think about it, it's not really a well-paid translation type. It's actually the second worst paid, in my opinion. The only thing that's worse paid than subtitling is literary translation. More or less any other type of translation is paid better. If you do the math, how much do you earn per hour?
Per hour,
yeah. But it's less. But it's fun, and this is why people want to do
you
it.
always like to see your name on the screen and all that.
Yes, and it's fun.
There's another discussion there. We maybe we don't go there.
So basically, with post editing, maybe for some people, what you're doing to them is you're taking the fun away. Right? So if you're taking the fun away, at least they should be making more money. So this is my argument as well in sharing the benefits from the post editing work. I do want to say something more in terms of rates that people complain about rates. I mean, it is good to think about the problem with the rates in our industry was a problem long before machine translation was there.
Yeah.
In around the turn of the century, up until the time that I kind of stopped being a freelancer, the rates were great, at least in London. They were fantastic. I was earning a lot of money. And then they started going, down, both for language service providers and for the individual translators. And they kept going down. And actually last year is the first time I ever heard in my career of rates going up again. Not for everyone, but I've heard that from a lot of language service providers and a lot of translators that they managed to increase their rates because of the demand and the lack of supply. So rates was an issue long before machine translation came about. So you should think the companies that people are complaining about, were they paying well before machine translation for non-post editing jobs? Were those rates good? Is it really that the machine translation rates are the bad ones, or are all the rates bad in that in that a specific vendor might be offering?
Those vendors are probably worse now. Guille?
Yeah, you mentioned, Yota, that about translators being more tired or less tired. So we have to do some research on that, and to me that's closely linked to the concept of burnout and how present that is today, and how it actually has an impact on translators' lives. And it also reminds me of languages in the media conference, where in one of the talks, I don't exactly recall which one, but one of the executives said something like, well, you work in this in subtitling for a few years and then go somewhere else, follow your dreams. So how do you feel, well, if post-editing is less fun, we don't know if it's more tiring or not, if it's more demanding or not, cognitively speaking, but do you know of any studies about how that could have an impact on burnout, on people leaving the field, and that also has a consequence, like then it's harder to find people to do the job or to do the job properly or have enough experience. So how do you feel about that?
So first of all, let me just correct something. I didn't say that post-editing could be fun for some people. I do know people that like to edit, that like being editors, that prefer editing and proofreading to translation. I do know such people. I just know fewer of them than the other way around, right? Okay. So post-editing for many translators could be easy. Let me say something else first, and then I'll get back to your question.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Sure.
it is very interesting, and I think it's very important for translators to know how they work, to be more self-aware about how they work and how they make their living. I don't think translators are. I've had a few cases when I was conducting experiments on machine translation post-editing, when people were surprised by, how much faster, for instance, they were when they were post-editing, according to my metrics, than what they expected, than what they thought. And I'm not saying they were lying. It's just that that's what their expectation was. I mean, even Damian, when we worked together a few years ago, and we worked on a comedy and a documentary. I remember, Damian, you said you expected machine translation to help you more in the documentary, and in the end, the metrics showed that it made that the machine translation improved your speed further. More in the comedy instead of the documentary.
That was weird.
You were surprised by that. You were not the only one. That happened with others as well. I don't think people are as aware as they should be. I think if your focus is to make more money because you need to make a living, because you have a family to support and so on, which we all do, you need to be more aware as to where and what tasks do you make more money out of?
Go do legal translation.
And well, not necessarily. And what is it that you do because you just enjoy it, right? And then sometimes people do come in the industry because they enjoy it a lot. It's more.
Yeah, it's not all about money.
Exactly. They don't get paid necessarily a lot, but if you don't get paid at all or hardly enough to make a living, then it's not a job anymore, it's a hobby, right? So one important thing, I think it's important for people to know what their speed is in the various tasks that they undertake so they can make informed decisions about their life. It doesn't, of course everyone has different priorities, but it's good to be conscious about it. I want this job because I like it, or because I'm going to have fun, or because it's going to be easy, or because I'm going to earn more. You need to be conscious about the decisions that you're making and what happens to you as a translator. And translation speed, I'm not talking even about post-editing, I'm talking about plain translation speed, varies a lot.
I'm very slow. Yeah. I'm a very slowish translator, yeah.
It varies a lot with a lot of different people. And it's good to be aware, right? Because you need to make choices sometimes, and you should make the choices that are better for you. I did have another point here. Yes, okay. So the other point I wanted to make is subtitling is a very creative job, right? And a lot of people, and I love those translators, who really get into the text, who are like authors, right? Who really agonize over every word that they translate and produce a fantastic translation that you really enjoy reading afterwards. And you say, that was a great film. I really enjoyed that. So these people are probably spending hours thinking about how to translate a specific pun, turn of phrase. It's the kind of thing, the kind of feeling that you have, and it has happened to me as well when I was translating. When you wake up in the middle of the night, or when you're when you're doing something completely relevant, and then suddenly the translation that you were trying to think of a specific turn of phrase comes to you, and you interrupt everything else that you're doing to go and actually correct, a single word that you have thought of how to translate better. Certainly, this is not good from a productivity point of view, right? You probably end up spending a lot more time in that translation than you would otherwise. Now, but you enjoy it more. You feel like the author. Maybe you're not tired at all when you do that because of the enjoyment factor. Now, when you are post-editing, you are no longer the author. It's some other person, not persons, a machine's text in this case. When you're editing, it's someone else's translation. So you don't get so involved. You're not the author anymore. It's not your own text, so you can progress through the text faster. Instead of thinking for half an hour, is this translation really the best one for this sentence? You probably find a good translation instantly. You say, yeah, that works. Move on to the next one. And you end up working faster. So I can imagine situations where post-editing can help people work faster and produce more work, and therefore, since you're paid by the minute, end up earning more money as well. So
they have to ask themselves if they like that
as well. Yes, if they have to ask themselves if they like that, or they have to ask themselves if they just are okay with that necessarily, because at the end of the day they have to make, the rent or whatever. The concept of burnout that you asked is different. Everyone is burning out, from what I hear. There's so much work that I hear people talking about burnout on the translation front, but also in language service providers, in content owners, everywhere. Mm-hmm. So this has to do with the volume of work that there is. From a translator's point of view, I've been told that it has to do also with the constant updates, because the turnaround times are so much shorter. People don't always work with final materials, or there are corrections and amendments and a ton more of emails than I had to deal with, certainly, when I was a freelancer. So the constant interruption to the focused work can also, of course, lead you to burnout. And Guillermo or you, Damian, I don't know, one of you mentioned about the volume and a lot of new people in the profession. There is a lot of new people in the profession. There's a lot of language service providers that are not traditionally media localizers that are entering our space because of the growth that right now I'm in the Lind group for the European Commission, where we talk about what is happening in the language industry in general. And the last few months, pretty much I'm the only one that is talking about growth, because I'm the only one talking about the audiovisual sector. And more or less all the other sectors, there's problems. So because of this growth, language service providers, non-media ones, want to come in the media space. Also, even if they don't want to, they have to deal with video for their other clients, for their institutional clients, for their technical clients, e-learning clients. So there's a lot of people a lot of translators who did not traditionally work in subtitling, but worked in other translation fields, that are now coming into subtitling. There's a lot of new blood. These people are already accustomed to using machine translation and translation memories and all of these tools. I think they will expect it. They will expect to work on such tasks. I will not say they will want. They will expect to work on such tasks. So I don't think there will be as much resistance in the future because of the new blood. The translators that are graduating university, I have friends of mine that are professors at university teaching translation, who tell me, not just subtitling, translation in general, right? Who tell me that their students don't want to translate without machine translation. They find it easier. Of
course.
Yes. It's like, it's how you grow up. I expect the younger generation, and it would be easier to actually have a poll on this with demographics and age groups to see.
But in those cases, do you think that they can become those translators who are better than machine translation?
Well, becoming better has to do with practice and experience. Yeah. If you've just graduated, clearly you're not better than someone who's been doing the job for 20 years. So they need the right training, and they need to be trained, in my opinion, to translate from scratch without any aid. Just as they need to learn how to spell without having
that came up to my mind, because I was thinking, if you learn to translate from scratch to just correct Google Translate, then how you're going to be better at some point.
Yes, part of the training definitely has to do
challenge
with that. I had some note here about, because there's a question that I keep asking in conferences. Yes. So I do keep asking people, I'm interested in asking translators how much they use machine translation for video localization work. So, and because I chair panels a lot, I've kind of developed a habit of asking this question almost every time. And I've noticed an increase in the uptake. From the answers, I've noticed an increase on the uptake of the technology, even among subtitlers. So I asked this question at the Translating Europe Forum in November, how much people use machine translation in video localization. 20% of the participants answered that they've never used machine translation or tried it and don't use it because it doesn't work for them. 43% said that they use it for a lot or the bulk of their work because it makes them more productive. And 29% said that they use it as an aid, even if it doesn't make them faster yet. So the numbers are going up favorably towards the use of MT as time goes by. And I would really like to know, I would have loved to know what the answers were with much larger numbers of people than, the ones that are attending my panel only. It would be good if, an association like ATRAE could do some such research and even check the demographics to see in which age group these preferences correspond to. I think that would be very interesting. I like to compare also with how I use technology, being of a certain age, with how my son uses technology. So we were playing this game on the same game on my phone. The game gave you some help to go to the next level, right? I don't remember the details of it. And I remember that me being born in the 70s and growing up as I grew up, it was like, I can do this, I'm the best, I don't need any help to go to the next level, I'll just do it because I'm so good. And this is how I would play the game. And then my son would play the game, and what he would do always is, first of all, look at the help and use all the help. It would be, impossible to him to think to play the game in any other way. What I was doing for him was simply crazy. And I wonder whether this is maybe how the new generation of translators might think about machine translation, that this is my help. And this is what I will use to translate. And especially as the machine translation improves, at some point it will be a no-brainer.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that if you think it was going to happen like it did with CAD tools and all that. Yeah,
I do think it will. I do think it will. With time.
The thing
right?
that I see and I see it from your conversation is that maybe since subtitlers were never introduced in their workflows to CAD tools, that's why it's more difficult for them to incorporate machine translation. Because, like you said, if I've been translating, engineering text for 20 years, I've been through this like 10 years ago, So, but first I went through Trados and all that, and then I went through machine translation and all that. And so maybe that's why it's more difficult for us.
Yes, and it also has to do with age again, because of what you studied at university, right? I mean, when I was studying translation, there were no CAD tools to be taught. Things were just starting after I graduated. So, I never experienced this at university. People do experience all these things at university today, so they will be more accustomed to all of these tools, irrespective of which field of translation they go to. And of course, if translators are even, they know the tools and even involved in their development and in their implementation, then it will be a lot easier for them to take this up. I think that, as I said, the technology will keep getting better and better, and there won't be a point resisting this. And I already see the first signs of this, because there are more people that are accepting of it now. Yeah, I do think that this will happen. But however, I don't think post-editing will go away anytime soon, not for creative fields like ours. I do expect it will be there for a while. It'll just be easier, I suppose, with time.
I can only hope that all the LSPs in the world have you as a consultant, so and they listen to you. Guille?
Yeah, we're talking about post-editing all the time, and I'm interested in the pre-editing side as well. So, like, do you know of any studies that research how a template creation impacts post-editing work and machine translation as well?
Yes, that's a great question, actually. Right. So, two ways to answer it. Clearly, of course, when you use machine translation, you have to have a template. You have to have a file to translate, right? So and it makes sense that when you have simpler syntactic structures, more straightforward ones, subject, verb, object, the machine translation will give you better output, right? I mean, that's common sense. It's only logical. So the nice edited templates with low reading speeds that we used to have, 20 years ago, the ones that I would use to work with and which I still prefer, those would lend themselves better for machine translation. I actually did this test when I was working with statistical machine translation, and the quality of the machine translation output clearly was better when you were using such templates. So it is my hope that because of machine translation, maybe we will return to better edited templates for that reason. There is some research in simplifying source text automatically, and actually Netflix has published something on this, looked into pre-editing of the source text and simplifying the source text before the machine translation in order to improve the machine translation output. You don't necessarily have to do this automatically. You could just create a more edited template to begin with. Instead of creating something more verbatim and then trying to automatically simplify it. Unless you also get the transcript automatically, then you try to automatically simplify it, which is something that people have worked on. Aptec actually, which is a company I consult for that produces machine translation for subtitling, have actually worked on not simplification, but automatic editing down of text. So not summarization, because summarization is a lot more severe condensation of text. So for the type of condensation that we have in subtitling, they have actually worked on that and they have developed something like that. It's kind of like machine translating into the same language. That's how it works, more or less. So my hope on this is that the templates will improve because of the fact that these more edited templates give you better machine translation output. We all know that one of the cardinal rules of subtitling is one sentence, one subtitle.
Yes.
change the passive voice into active, make the syntax simpler because that's easier for the viewer to read, faster to read, easier to comprehend, right? All of these things, if they're and when people don't do these things anymore as much as they used to in the past, and templates are a lot more verbatim these days than they used to be. So these things actually work in favor of machine translation. So I'm hoping that because of that, we'll revert back to that, because I did have a preference for these better templates because the result is better for the viewer, in my opinion, anyway.
Definitely is. I do have one final question. What happens when the machine, if you know, when the machine translation doesn't have like a great background from previous corpora, and this is, I'm thinking specifically for the case of Argentine variation, because it's something new. If you do know that we have neutral Spanish in Latin America, so we do have a lot of things translated into neutral, but only in Mexico there were local translations, and now it started to appear in Argentina. So if we put this, That's what I want to know. What happens if you say to the machine, translate this into not Argentinian, because they do have some text now, but if you want to do now, I don't know, Colombian Spanish, and there are no or very few translations, do you think it would take a long time to do it? What happens? It can do it anyway?
Okay, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not the most qualified one to answer this. But my gut feeling is, I would guesstimate that no, it can't work. You need the corpora. Basically, you can't train neural machine or statistical machine translation systems without corpora. If you don't have the corpora, that's it. You have to create corpora first. And there are better models now, multilingual models, and that go from many languages into many languages. So there's ways to actually improve the machine translation output, even for the lesser sourced languages. But you do need some corpora. If you don't have them, then you can't do it. So the corpora would have to be created first.
Okay, great. That's what I thought too. But I just wanted to check. So this is we can. I do have like 4-5 more questions, but we are out of time. So just wanna ask you, what's your view? We've been talking about this from the beginning, and I think that we can end up on a positive note. But just give you the mic to give us your view on the future of translators, particularly in the case of the visual translation, of course.
Well, I think the profession will keep changing inevitably, but it has always changed, right? As I said, there's more language service providers, traditional ones, new players coming into the market, more translators outside of media localization that are coming into the market. I think there will continue to be M&A. Video localization will expand even more to all domains, basically. So if you are a subtitler, you won't just be working for entertainment content, but for any kind of content. And the fact that, the people that will come into the market that have been traditionally using machine translation and translation memories, I think this will help machine translation spread further. And then the biggest disruption, I think, in our field will be in dubbing, actually. We didn't talk at all about that. We already see some dubbing editors that look a lot like fancy enhanced subtitle editors. I think they will become widespread and a means for streamlining dubbing. I expect to see dubbing templates making an emergence in the near future. I expect to see many subtitlers who don't like post-editing, perhaps, being converted into dubbing script adapters. This is a job that's quite niche still. In many countries, it's performed by monolingual editors. There's a lack of dubbing script adapters, actually, and this is why there are initiatives to increase the pool of translators that work on dubbing script adaptation. And it's a lot harder to machine translate scripts for dubbing because you have the lip sync element there as well. Of course, there are efforts to automate that too, but it's a lot harder, right? So I expect to see a lot of people going into that. So, if you want to be creative, that's another creative translation job that is not likely to be affected by machines soon. And I also expect to see the use of synthetic voices expand in more types of video, because speech synthesis, I don't know if you've watched what's going on with speech synthesis. It's my new favorite language technology. And it's improved tremendously. Now we're able to control the pitch, the style, the tempo, and also the emotion of the voice. So I expect that we will have some people that will have to work and post-edit synthetic voices, voice editing. And who will these people be? Maybe they will be translators, right? Maybe this will be another type of job that translators can perform. Write the translated text and then voice it synthetically and listen to it and make sure that it's pronounced correctly by post-editing the synthetic voice. And of course, I do believe that machine translation is here to stay and that it will improve further. We've already said that many times. But as I said, I don't think post-editing will disappear for a while. Until I retire, is what I like to say. And I just turned 50, so that's quite longer.
Oh, yeah.
If you trust my predictions.
We have 50 more years to go, okay.
Okay, not 50 more years. I'm not going to be working until 100 or live until then. But,
I don't know.
But I think, my advice to translators is, especially those that don't like post-editing, is to be agile, to become more aware of their own values so they can go after the jobs that are right for them, the ones that machines can't do yet, like dubbing, script adaptation, right? So there's a lot of options. It's not just post-editing. And also, you can also do what I'm doing, which is, advise on what machines can and cannot do and help in the development of machines. Be the one that tells machines how to work. Curate content for machine translation purposes, for instance. I do believe there will be a lot of varied tasks for people to do. And I do believe also that translators are inherently very flexible people and, can go into different directions. Just look at your students, what jobs they end up doing and how they end up using their language and translation skills. So I think the future is bright for translation. I don't think people need to be afraid of technology. I think, language is the last thing that will be fully automated. There will be other things that will be fully automated first. And
let's hope so.
So it's very hard. So that's the reason. So yeah, that's my 5 cents.
Thank you so much. I mean, it was an amazing interview, and I have a million things to ask you. So you'll be back on the show because we have lots to talk about. So, and it's always a pleasure to listen to you, and I really enjoyed this interview. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jan and Guillermo and Blanca. I really enjoyed it as well. I hope our audience has enjoyed it. It's been my pleasure. And all the best. I will look forward to your questions.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, you too.
Muy bien, muy buena la entrevista con Yota. ¿Qué les pareció, Guille?
Pues una pasada, la verdad es que se nota que es consultora y buena consultora. Ya me gustaría que algunas empresas, incluso internacionales, tuvieran esa perspectiva sobre todas estas tecnologías y cómo aplicarlas y tal. Y vamos, que la contraten y que la escuchen.
Que la escuchen sobre todo, esa es la parte más importante.
Sí, que la escuchen porque es verdad que es un tema tabú y cuesta sacarlo y todos somos reacios a determinadas cosas, pero hay que matizar, ¿no? Una cosa es la tecnología y otra cosa es cómo se esté aplicando. También creo que se han quedado algunas cosas en el tintero. Yo sé que a Yota le gusta hablar de reconocimiento de habla. También algún artículo suyo que he leído en su web hablaba también de lo útil que era diferenciar las fuentes de la traducción, saber si es traducción automática, si es memoria de traducción, si es memoria de traducción, de dónde salen las propuestas que te hace el software, etcétera, ¿no? Y todo esto, pues, a ver, no podemos meterlo todo en una entrevista, pero significa que habrá que volverla a invitar. Y ya para acabar, no quiero tampoco acaparar esto, pero voy a hacer la cuña publicitaria porque Estíbaliz Cabañes y yo sacamos un artículo sobre la posedición, donde hablamos de mitos y realidades de la posedición, que si queréis profundizar entre entrevista con Yota y entrevista con Yota, pues ahí tenemos el artículo en la linterna del traductor. También tenemos el enlace en las redes, así que pues nada, yo creo que es un tema que da mucho del que hablar.
Me sorprendió mucho con el juego que hiciste en Twitter de que no fue tan fácil para la gente reconocer una cosa de la otra. Me acuerdo que en el Hispatab sí todo el mundo era como que reconocía cuál era digamos, la posedición y cuál era la traducción de cero, pero me sorprendió un montón. Será porque Twitter vota a cualquier gente, supongo.
Ojo, sí.
Pero,
yo creo que hay varias cosas.
En algunas respuestas era como... Después entren al Twitter de Guille si no saben de qué estamos hablando, pero básicamente era que Guille puso los ejemplos de dos traducciones y identificar cuál era poseditada y identificar cuál era traducida de cero. Y me sorprendió un montón de que había ejemplos en los que era 50 y 50 básicamente la respuesta.
Ojo que había 2 de esos, de los 11 que puse. O sea, realmente...
Pero era muy fácil inclusive esos
claro.
2, ¿no?
Sí, yo creo que hay varias cosas. Primero que la gente, por defecto, mucha gente comentó que no sabía qué era la posedición, que entendían que la posedición era traducción automática arreglada y mejorada y ya está. Entonces estaban votando lo que ellos creían que ya estaba arreglado. Entonces, bueno, también culpa mía por no acabar de explicarlo bien y también porque no se miraron lo que era posedición. Por eso había mucha gente que no sabía del tema.
Claro, de votar sin saber de qué estás hablando, claro. Sí.
Claro, y otros que intuitivamente votaban al revés. O sea, intuitivamente iban a elegir, en vez de darle la respuesta que había pasado por traducción automática, la que se supone que era humana, porque ellos tiraban hacia lo bueno por defecto, ¿no? Entonces, eso también afectó. Y yo creo que incluso cuando lo hicimos en el ISPATAP, claro, nos quedamos con la impresión un poco en general, pero no votó todo el mundo. A lo mejor si hubiera votado todo el mundo, el resultado habría sido más equilibrado o no tan...
Habría
claro.
que hacer esa prueba con algún sistema de estos de votación en vivo.
Sí,
algo así,
pero
¿no?
si no es algo tipo Twitter, que por cierto, no se me ocurrió hacerlo en su momento, pero si no es Twitter, es de pago y no es barato. Pero sí, hay que probar todas estas cosas. Nada, es que influye, claro. Yo estaba preparando mi presentación y digo, a ver, me voy a suscribir todo un año a esta plataforma para hacer una votación un día. No, hombre, no. Pero sí, y luego también influye, creo que en Latinoamérica hay algunas de esas fórmulas que aún se usan. O sea, el cielos en España nos parece una barbaridad, pero en el español neutro...
No, por el neutro, claro. Sí,
la gente lo usa y lo lee y no le llama la atención en absoluto. Entonces, claro, todo esto influye en la percepción.
Sí, sin lugar a dudas. Blanca, ¿qué te parece la entrevista?
Yo estoy muy contenta porque no lo he confesado en la entrevista porque me daba vergüencita, ¿no? Pero yo era muy fan de Yota durante el doctorado y de hecho el libro que tiene del 2009, Reduction Levels in Subtitling, para mí fue importantísimo. Porque como mi tesis es del Pleistoceno, yo trabajé con series en DVD. Y entonces ella justamente era una de las autoras que había hablado pues, de subtitling for the DVD industry en la tesis y en ese libro. Y bueno, es una persona a la que he seguido y estoy muy contenta de haberla podido entrevistar en el podcast. Y luego me ha parecido muy inspiradora esa casi última frase que nos ha dicho, ¿no? De que las lenguas parece que van a ser lo último que se pueda automatizar del todo. Creo que lo diga una persona como ella da mucha esperanza, la verdad.
A mí la verdad que sí, es una persona que la vengo, no tanto como vos, pero la vengo siguiendo hace unos cuantos años. He tenido la suerte de trabajar para ella y con ella en varios proyectos, así que realmente... tenía muchas ganas de hacer una entrevista, pero como dice Guille, es una persona para la cual tendríamos que usar 2 o 3 programas porque sinceramente quedaron muchas cosas. A mí, una de las cosas que publicó recientemente en su sitio web tenía que ver con una encuesta que hizo entre la preferencia entre software en la nube o software en escritorio, y eso es un tema muy interesante también para tener en cuenta porque cambia mucho con las modalidades de trabajo, pero también está bueno que haga estas cosas que hace, que es escuchar a la gente, ¿no? Por ejemplo, ver lo que opina el profesional en este ámbito y en otros ámbitos, en un congreso, lo que sea, y después ella tiene la suerte de poder llevarlo a las empresas, ¿no? Que eso también es algo que está muy bien porque muchas veces se hacen estudios o análisis, pero después eso no llega a quienes toman las decisiones sobre procesos, ese tipo de cosas, así que me gusta que pueda mezclar esas dos cosas. Bueno, muy bien, hasta aquí llegamos entonces con el episodio de hoy. Recuerden visitar a nuestro patrocinador Auna en su sitio web una.net y registrarse para las 4 semanas de prueba. Recuerden también que pueden encontrar toda la información del podcast en nuestro sitio web www.ensincroniapodcast.com y también en nuestro canal de YouTube, donde van a encontrar la versión con subtítulos del capítulo, y que también pueden suscribirse a la gacetilla del programa. Esto es algo nuevo que tenemos en nuestra gacetilla, espero que se suscriban, así reciben información de todos los episodios. El enlace para la suscripción a la gacetilla lo van a encontrar en nuestros perfiles de Instagram, así que se meten ahí, cargan su información, nos cuentan qué episodio les gustó más, qué temas quieren que tratemos en mayor profundidad o más todavía en el podcast, así también conocemos un poco más a quienes están del otro lado escuchándonos, y bueno, sobre todo para que no se pierdan después ninguna de las novedades de los episodios, y lo pueden encontrar entonces ahí en nuestras cuentas de Instagram. Hasta la próxima.